that, what really set it off was I started to get existential thoughts. And that was the big kicker for me when like really went into full DP, like constantly, like what even is life? What am I doing here? What am I supposed to be doing here? Like weird things like that, as I'm sure other people have experienced. And now I can say them or think about them, and it's not a concern. But in the moment, they were terrifying.
Hey everyone, I'm Sean O'Connor, author of the Depersonalization Manual, and today I'm speaking with Pat Viviers in New Hampshire. Pat is 27 years old. In 2022, Pat develops depersonalization disorder triggered by a panic attack he had at a concert. Pat struggled with depersonalization disorder and its symptoms for about 7 months, and as he described to me in a recent email, I thought that my life was over and that there was nothing I could do about it. I still have anxious moments and stressful days like anyone else, but you helped me get through the symptoms of DPDR that lasted for months. And Pat is with us today to talk about his experience with and recovery from depersonalization disorder. Pat, you're very welcome to the channel. Thanks for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Thanks for having me. It's cool to be here. Like I said before, I've listened to you a lot in my headphones, so now having a conversation is pretty cool. I appreciate it.
That's great, man. I'm delighted that the book was helpful, and it's great to have you on the channel. Pat, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Like I said, 27 years old. I live in New Hampshire, born and raised here. I currently work and have for close to 6 years now at a university. I advise graduate business students online. So I never actually meet them, just email and call them on the phone, stuff like that. Outside of work, snowboarding, reading, golf, lifting weights, and music are all a big part of my life. But yeah, that's about it.
Nice. Is New Hampshire a big skiing state?
Oh yeah, all of New England
really?
for sure. Yeah. Us and like then Maine and Vermont are all huge for skiing and snowboarding, definitely.
Nice. I have an aunt who lives in Maine, and my godson
Okay.
too. So I've been over a couple of times, and I'm a huge Stephen King fan. So
Oh, cool.
I absolutely love Maine. New England is so gorgeous. I've never
Yeah,
been to New Hampshire, but I must go someday.
yeah, yeah. It's really
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. So Pat, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with DPDR and how did it start for you?
Sure. Yeah. So, like you alluded to, it started kind of at this concert where I was having a panic attack. So it was, I mean, I go to concerts constantly with my brother. A couple times a month. We're frequenters to shows. We're at a larger festival, outdoors, and it's a big crowd, and we had been there for I think like 3 days already. So it's not like this was the first show that we were going to or anything like that. We're already, in the environment and everything. Late one night, we're watching a band play, and all of a sudden, like my chest kind of tightened up, started like feeling kind of weird, like everything felt kind of overwhelming. It kind of felt like sensory overload for a period of time, and um, yeah, it was very strange. It's kind of hard to describe, but it was like very intense and anxiety inducing, and it was really freaking me out because I had dealt with anxiety in the past and like really slight moments of like anxiety attacks, I guess you could call, but like nothing too serious. But this one seemed to hit a little bit harder, and it came out of nowhere. So I just said something to my brother. I was like, "Hey, I'm gonna step out of here for a minute. Like, let's go watch this other band play." There was like multiple venues at the place that we were at, so I was like, let's go over here just to kind of get away from everything, get away from the sound and the noise. Um, Night continued on. Was still like feeling kind of weird and in my head about that, and like nervous that like, man, what if that happens again, or what if that keeps happening? Those kind of thoughts. But the night went on, and everything was fine, but feeling like a little bit out of it. Like I would almost call it like I had like an afterglow from the panic attack is kind of how I felt at the moment. Didn't think much of it, went to sleep, woke up the next morning, still kind of had like what I was calling in my head like an afterglow of the panic attack. So I wasn't worried about it. I didn't think much of it. I just went through this thing. I was like, yeah, it'll go away. And then we go home, days go on, and I'm still feeling that a little bit, but it was so light that I wasn't worried about it. I wasn't really thinking much of it. I was aware of it, but it didn't impact me really on a day-to-day basis. Um, After that, like the weeks after that, it kind of never really went away. And then over the summer, like one of the first things that I noticed was my vision. Like I remember sitting in my bedroom, we were watching TV, and I was like, everything looks a little bit different. I at first thought that my eyes were like, maybe I need to get my eyes checked. Maybe there's something wrong with my eyes. Like I couldn't put my finger on it, but I just felt like there was something wrong with my vision. And I kind of had that for like a couple of weeks. Still kind of like an afterglow type feeling, like almost lightheaded, I guess is what you would call it, or a little bit spacey or brain foggy. But still at this point, it's like very light and manageable, not really impacting me much. But the vision thing was the first thing that I noticed. Again, couldn't really describe it to anybody other than that I don't think my eyes are great. I didn't get them checked or anything because when I thought about it, I was like, I can still see everything that I want to. Like I could read fine, all that. It just seemed a little bit weird. And then what really set it off in, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks after that, what really set it off was I started to get existential thoughts. And that was the big kicker for me when like really went into full DP, like constantly. Um, they kind of came out of nowhere. I was like with my friends and, now thinking about the thoughts, they don't seem too crazy. Like they're kind of like weird, vague questions asking like, what even is life? What am I doing here? What am I supposed to be doing here? Like weird things like that, as I'm sure other people have experienced. And, now I can say them or think about them and it's not a concern, but in the moment they were terrifying. And so that was really what started me to like full blown DP, where that was what I started having panic attacks over. So like the vision stuff and the kind of like lightheaded brain fog thing didn't mess with me too much. It was the existential thoughts that just threw me full bore into it. So then once that started, it because I was so concerned about it and because it scared me so much and I was constantly thinking about it and worrying about it, then it became like a full-time job where that's all I'm thinking about. That's all I'm doing. I'm just trying to get through my day without thinking about that. And then, that kind of escalated and made it makes sense in retrospect. They made me more anxious and panicky. So then the other symptoms started to escalate as well. So it was really when that stuff started that I really got like the pane of glass description that I kept seeing, like you're living behind a pane of glass, so to speak. But I oftentimes felt like I was watching myself live my life. Like I was kind of just separated, like behind where it's hard to put into words, like behind where I'm normally spectating from. Like I was just watching myself do things. And sometimes it was not noticeable, and other times it was like so intense that, I'm doing work on my computer and in my head, I'm like, I don't know how I'm even typing this email right now, or I don't know how I'm actually talking to this person right now. And yeah, like I was saying, the existential thoughts though were really what drove it. Like, I love lifting weights. I love going to the gym. It's part of my morning routine most days. And, yeah, like that was one day I showed up at the gym and was really cloudy. This is kind of after the existential thoughts had started, but they weren't too bad. They were noticeable, worrisome, but not like crazy. The day that they really kicked into full gear though was at the gym this morning. I show up, I go in the mornings. It's like 6 a.m. here is when I usually go. So, I felt like I was tired when I showed up. I felt kind of cloudy, kind of brain foggy as I got up. Maybe I didn't sleep well, whatever, who knows? I didn't think much of it. And then all of a sudden it was just full panic attack about like, what is my existence here? Who am I? Like those kinds of things. And I ended up having to leave the gym. And then the gym became like a place that was hard for me to get back to because I had experienced that. But um, yeah, so that was kind of what started it and how it progressed. And it stayed like that. It was only really intense for, I want to say about 2 months. I think it was like really intense. I had like, a month or so that was like constantly like that, just kind of debilitating, like struggling to get through anything. And then, I did a little bit, not a ton of the Googling. And I'm sure if I looked at my Google history, the questions are really weird, like anxiety, feeling weird, like
Yeah.
because it's hard to describe or write down. Yeah, so then it kind of started to taper off like a little bit, but was definitely still there. And then, I found the manual and implemented like a lot of that stuff. And it started to get better. But even at like the tail end, there was months that were like, I think I'm better. I think I'm recovered. And then all of a sudden I would like have a weird, slight existential thought. And I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not, So then my like new obsession became like, am I recovered? Am I not? It went from like checking in on myself to a new form of checking in on myself, but seeing if I was recovered. Um, but that went on for a little while, but it was so slight that I didn't really think about it that much other than trying to tell if I was recovered, which just puts you in another loop of checking on yourself and then you notice it and then it continues on. Yeah, and then it was weird. It stopped almost like it. I just forgot about it, I guess is the best way to put it. I remember thinking when things were starting to get better, I could like tell. I was like, my symptoms are getting better. I'm doing the right stuff. I'm gonna get out of this. Like when I started to get confident about it, I remember thinking like, man, when I wake up that day and it's not here anymore and it's gone, I'm going to be so excited. I was like, I'm going to email Sean and tell him. Like I was already stoked about it before it happened, and then I just kind of forgot about it. Like it went away as though it never was a thing for me before. So I never had that day where I got out of bed and was like, yeah, I'm good. And that was very weird. I guess I was expecting that and it never happened. But yeah, that was in a nutshell, kind of what happened.
Okay. Okay. Um, yeah, that's that's a very, very common experience with with recovery is that it kind of happens when you're looking in the other direction. You just
It was very weird.
yeah, yeah. It's it's so kind of opposite to because the onset of it feels so kind of like it feels like a switch has been flicked in your brain, and you're kind of then frantically trying to find that switch to turn it off again. And it feels so kind of sudden and fast initially that you're expecting that to happen in recovery as well. So you're like, okay, well, I'll just try a bunch of different things. I'll try a combination of things, and then I'll hit that switch, and then bang, it'll be gone as quickly as it started. And it's not at all. It's just like you're kind of training yourself out of a habit, and but a good aspect of recovery is to just kind of like have that expectation, or to just kind of okay, this isn't going. I'm not going to just like wake up in 24 hours and all thoughts and symptoms are gone, but they will fade away and stop while I'm
Yeah.
busy looking in the other direction. And just going back to the festival as well, Pat. So was this kind of like was it like day two or three of a festival? Had you been and also what kind of festival was it? Was it like was it what kind of music was it?
Yeah, so it's called Maryland Death Fest. I'm a huge metalhead, so it's like mostly death metal bands,
Hmm.
and they do a couple. I think there's like three or four. There's like one in Canada that we've been to. There's one in California. So it's like a group. They organize them all over the world. But yeah, it's a huge metal festival. But this was, I think, our third night, maybe second. But we had been there for a while, so we'd already seen, a dozen bands play. So it wasn't like it was like an uncomfortable environment or anything like that. It was
Yeah.
new, but we had been there for a period of time. Yeah.
Okay, okay. And like I know that for me, when I'm on the third day of a festival, I am like I'm finished. Like I'm I'm dragging myself to concerts at that stage, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I always kind of find I'm in quite a delicate state at that at that stage of
Yeah.
the festival. Uh, but the your description of the panic attack as well is like is very it's quite is familiar um and also kind of I guess having a panic attack in that situation as well where like you're in you're surrounded by people and like the music I presume is kind of pretty loud and intense like
Yep.
this but the and then the weirdest thing about it is that like I mean even though like you're in that place like that situation is something as you just said like you're familiar with it like this is this is like I love this music, I love these people, this is like a comfortable place, and then suddenly it's like oh god something is wrong. I is something bad going to happen? um and for me it was like I mean I was sitting at home at my parents' place watching the TV. Like there is no more kind of less dangerous or kind of more comfort place than that. And yet I had those same feelings. It's just such a good illustration of like the fact that the scariest thing about a panic attack is that it appears to be happening for no reason.
Yep.
You're why on earth do I feel scared? I love your description, Pat, of describing it initially as feeling like the afterglow of the panic attack. Like that's absolute. And when it first happened as well, Pat, did you recognize it as a panic attack? And afterwards, like did you say, okay, like I had a panic attack and I'm still feeling a bit shaken from it, or had you ever kind of had experiences like that before?
Uh, Not to that extent. No. Especially, I was dead sober. Like I had, a couple drinks or something, but there was like nothing else that was inducing it, which was more scary, I think. Like if I had done something, then I would have been like, all right, it's that. Like I can deal with that. I know what this is. But so that made it a little bit more scary, but I hadn't dealt with anything to that extent. And I think when it was going on, I wasn't cued into the fact that it was a panic attack. I didn't know exactly what was going on until maybe the end of it or like just afterward that I would have been able to label the panic attack. In During it though, I just felt incredibly overwhelmed and wasn't really able to get like a coherent thought pattern going about like, all right, here's what's going on, here's where I am, like kind of like grounding yourself almost. I wasn't able to get to that spot.
Yeah, yeah. What's really interesting as well is that like when I speak to people who have developed DPDR and there's been like drugs involved, which was the case with me, I had a bad weed experience, and their biggest worry is that like, oh, this has been triggered by a drug, so I'm in serious trouble.
Mhm.
And then when I speak to people who develop it from when there's no drug involved, it's just like a panic attack, or they haven't been sleeping, or they're stressed out. Their worry is that like, well, mine didn't have a trigger, so I'm in serious trouble. You
Yeah.
know, so it's funny that like whichever the situation is, you catastrophize that yours is
It's
the worst
worse.
one. Yeah.
And
Um.
I did have that too when I was a month or so after this after the panic attack, when I'm like full blown DP all the time. I did have that kind of thought where I could tell it was anxiety driven. Like I'm sitting at my desk working and my heart is like racing, my chest is tight. Like I could tell that I was super anxious. But what made me really concerned about being able to recover was the thought that like I don't know what I'm anxious about. It wasn't like I have a job interview, I have this big thing coming up, I have to do whatever it is. Like it's a Tuesday, I'm answering emails, and you would think I like the world is ending or something based on what my body's doing. And that terrified me for sure. That took me a long time to get over and like get the confidence of like, no, I can recover from this because, like I said, I didn't know what I was anxious about.
Yeah. The and that's the kind of the core of anxiety is that like there's no or anxiety based conditions is that like there's no reason for it to be happening. You're
Exactly.
in a safe place. There's no there's no burning building, there's no car crash, there's no wild animal chasing you, and yet your body is reacting as if all of those things are happening at the same time,
Yeah.
and you're just literally trying to watch a movie or answer an email or something. And then of course trying to interpret that and make sense of it. Then we catastrophize. Well, there must be something profoundly wrong with me, that like there's a circuit that's been fried in my brain and I'm stuck thinking like this, and then that just keeps the anxiety going, and this feedback loop lasts for much longer than than it needs to.
Yeah.
So Pat, did you stay working in this time? Did you work throughout that process or that time?
Yeah, when it first started, I took like a night. I worked one night a week. I worked late nights. And my girlfriend got home from work, and she could tell that I wasn't doing so hot. She had like I At this point I wasn't able to like put into words really what was going on. Um, but I told her like what was going on. She was like, just log out, like take the night off. Your work doesn't care. They're super flexible. So I took like one night off, and that was it. I worked through the rest of it.
How was that for you? Because I know it's something that I certainly notice as well, but people do often say to me that if they're working jobs where they're on their computer a lot, that they can find it to be quite difficult, especially with the visual symptoms. If you're looking at like a white email compose screen, like you're going to be quite focused on little kind of like floaters and tracers happening, and people can often find that that's a difficult situation for them to be in.
Yep. Yeah, definitely the visuals of the computer were worrisome, I would say. It was super bright and like overwhelming, I guess. As far as like working itself, so like I was saying, I deal with students like on the phone. Talking to people was actually pretty beneficial because they're throwing questions at me. I'm having to look stuff up as they're talking, so I'm like very focused in what I'm doing. But my day, I'm not doing that for 8 hours. I have a lot of downtime the day where I'm answering emails, looking at like reports and stuff. And during those times where I don't have something that I'm really focused in on, I'm just browsing stuff. That those moments were really challenging because then it like the really terrible existential thoughts were coming in. I'd be terrified, and in the back of my head, I'm like, I'm just sitting at my desk. Like I shouldn't be this terrified while I'm just sitting here trying to answer an email or something like that. And I would also like have thoughts like while I'm emailing somebody or like while I'm talking to somebody, briefly, that I would just be like, I wonder if the person on the other side of this has any idea of what I'm going through. I didn't know if I was like coming across as like my answers were different or if you could hear it in my voice or something. So I thought about that a fair amount too. But yeah, overall working helped, but there was aspects of it that were challenging too.
So the main symptoms that you mentioned, Pat, were the visual symptoms, and then the existential thoughts became an issue. Was there anything, and the feeling of the pane of glass feeling as well?
Yeah.
Was it those three primarily, or were there any other symptoms that you were experiencing?
No, those were the main three, I would say. Yeah, the pane of glass thing, like I kind of described it as like watching myself do things. That was like what I would notice immediately, and then I would start thinking about it, and then I would get existential thoughts. It was kind of like a combo deal between those two things. And the vision was more so at the beginning, and then in certain circumstances. Like I was watching one of your interviews, and somebody said something about when they would go into a grocery store and the bright lights. I remember that. That was like very intense and picked up on it immediately. But that one didn't bother me as much. I noticed it, but it didn't terrify me like the other two things. It was really the pane of glass simulation type feeling, and the existential thoughts for sure that were the worst of it for my experience.
It's interesting what you say about the gym as well, Pat, because I remember when I started going to the gym, but this was during my experience with DPDR, and initially when I went in, my first reaction was like, there's not a hope in hell I'd be able to do this, because like there's like, I mean, there's bright lights, there's loud music, there's people everywhere. I have to talk to people, and initially it was quite hard. And I hadn't ever kind of gone to the gym before that. I wasn't never really a gym person. And then once I kind of got into the routine of it, and I just saw kind of nothing but benefits, um, it was a big part of my recovery, and it's a practice I've been kind of doing to this day. But I can imagine that from your experience, like you went into this like knowing the benefits of going to the gym and working out and all the good stuff that comes with that, and then kind of finding that like the gym became a place that you were afraid of, or that you had that initial frightening experience in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually took like a week or two off when it first started. And because I went to the gym, it was horrible. So I was like, maybe I just need like a little bit of time off and just get some extra sleep, stuff like that. Turned out that was not the right thing to do. That was definitely a mistake right from the get-go. But one thing that helped me get back into it, my girlfriend lifts weights too. So she's a school teacher, so her schedule is kind of wacky. But in this case, it was going on in the summer. So when she was able to, we would go at the same time and we would do lifts together. And just having like somebody there made a huge difference for me. So then slowly, like I was able to integrate back into my normal routine. It was never easy to get there for sure. And I think another thing that wasn't helping my case in the gym setting is, like I said, I go early in the morning, so I always take some form of caffeine, whether it be pre-workout or like an espresso shot before, because I've heard you allude to this as well, and you hit the nail on the head with this description. Sometimes you feel like you're half asleep, and you just think, if I have a little bit of caffeine, I'll be good to go. I'll feel like myself again, and this won't be an issue. So, and it was just such like a habitual thing. I'd wake up, drink some water, have some caffeine, and then go. And then I started reading the manual, and you were like, definitely don't do that. So I eventually stopped, and that made a huge difference for me. Like when I cut out caffeine, that was like, I noticed immediate changes in how I was feeling throughout the day. But yeah, once I was able to get back in the gym and be there like a little bit more comfortably, I'd have my headphones on, I'm listening to music, and I would definitely have periods of time, 30 or so minutes where I wasn't thinking about it at all. All I'm thinking about is my workouts, and it was those moments where I had, even if it was a couple of minutes or a half an hour in this case, it was those moments that I started to realize, like, I'm pretty sure that this isn't permanent. Like, as terrible as it seems sometimes, and the weird thought patterns I get into, as bad as they are, like I can have half an hour at the gym where I'm not thinking about it at all. And that was kind of when I started to piece together, like, I think I can get through this. Because even listening to your manual, I was doubtful that I could get through it. And a lot of it was because, like what I was talking about before, I was like, I don't even know what I'm anxious about. If there was a thing that I could get past, that would be cool. But there wasn't really. So I was like, I don't think I'm getting out of this. But those moments in the gym was a huge part of it. Made me start to realize that I could, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I had a very similar experience with the caffeine, especially at the start of it. I love coffee. I drink lakes of coffee, and at the time when I remember like feeling like, well, I feel like I'm super tired, and I feel like I'm kind of dreamy or woozy.
Mhm.
So I was like, well, what happens? What happens when I feel tired and woozy? Like, I drink more coffee. So I was like hammering into massive cups of coffee, like to try and wake myself up, like while at the start of an anxiety condition.
Yeah.
It's like, if I go back and like grab myself and just, Sean, no, put down the cup.
Yeah.
But look, but we just make the decisions we make with the information we have, and we always just think this is the best option. um so at any point did you speak to any doctors or therapists about what was happening?
Yeah, I did briefly see a therapist, and that was when I figured out what I was going through because I had no idea. I just knew I showed up there and I told her that I'm not feeling like myself. I'm super anxious all the time and I'm having panic attacks about existential thoughts that I seem to have no control over. Was kind of like how I described it to her. Um, and she didn't really know. So we kind of, we did some stuff and she was basically treating it just like anxiety, which makes sense. But I would leave and I was like, we're not really getting to the root of it. Like, I feel like this isn't just, I'm not just anxious about something. There's something else here. So then I really like tried to hammer that down one time when I was talking with her. And then she was like, well, have you ever heard of depersonalization? And I had just from Googling, but I really didn't know. And she was like, maybe that's what this is. So we talked about that a little bit. And that was when I kind of went down like the Google rabbit hole that a lot of people seem to go down. But that was how I found the manual. So it ended up being a good thing. But yeah, I did for a period. I didn't go for super long. Honestly, the biggest thing I got out of it was I realized what it was. And then I was like, okay, I think I can handle this on my own. Because the other thing I found was that when I was talking about it with this person for 45 minutes or whatever, I would leave and I would almost feel worse because I was just like ruminating on all the negative things that I was feeling. So in my case, it didn't help a ton in that sense, other than that we were able to peg down, or at least we were pretty sure we were able to peg down like what it was that was going on. So I got that out of it for sure. But I never went to a doctor about it or anything. I heard some people in interviews say that they went and got their eyes checked. I didn't do that either, although I fully understand that thought for sure. I did have thoughts that like something medical might be going on. And this is actually how I started, how I emailed you again, because I had kind of forgotten about DP for a couple months before I emailed you about it. Just thanking you. My girlfriend brought up something. I don't even remember what we were talking about exactly. Just like weird medical thoughts. And I told her, I was like, I don't think I've told you this story before, but I was going to the grocery store once and I was sitting in the car and I have DP. I'm very much like behind a pane of glass feeling at this moment. And I remember thinking to myself, like, I wonder if something is wrong with my brain. And then I transitioned to that to, I wonder if I have like brain cancer or something. Like, I wonder if this is like a tumor on my brain and that's what's causing this. And if they took it off, then I'd be perfectly fine again. I remember having a lot of stuff like that too, or I'd get up from the couch and I'd be noticeably kind of lightheaded and I would think, this is kind of a funny thought in retrospect, but I would think like, man, one of these times I'm just gonna pass out and I'm gonna wake up in the hospital and they're gonna have solved whatever this problem is. But I remember thinking it was like a physical thing. So I had those, but I never acted on it because I was able to, with the therapist and everything, kind of figure out like what it was pretty quickly.
Is there a specific time or moment, Pat, that was your lowest point in the experience? Is there any moment that sticks with you?
Yeah, I would say there's two kind of for different reasons. One was really early on. It's a weird memory, but I Googled how do you know if you're going crazy? Which in retrospect is a pretty out there Google search, but to me it was such a scary moment because I was like accepting the fact that I think there's something terribly wrong. Um, so that was a low point early on, and then the other one was really early on too, which was went to the gym, came back, and I was like so anxious that I thought I was gonna vomit, and so I'm like laying on the bathroom floor, like thinking that I have to throw up just because of how anxious I was. And that was, yeah, I think those two things kind of stand out as being like the low points of the entire experience, but for vastly different reasons. But yeah, those two stand out.
You mentioned some of this this part of the story before, Pat, but can you tell us a bit more about what recovery felt like and What was it like when you started to kind of maybe get back to the gym and realize, okay, hang on, I think I can actually do this again? What was that process like?
Yeah, so I just made things a routine, which works well for me. I'm a super structured person. I wake up at the same time every day and stuff like that. So I just had to make a routine out of it. So in the mornings, I would wake up, no caffeine, go to the gym, come home, do my stuff in the morning, and then before work, I would listen to the relaxation program that you had. And then, so I would just lay on the couch for like 12 minutes or whatever it is, come to work. And then I would do that again on my lunch break before I went for a walk. Um, and then I would do that again at night. I would just lay down and listen to it like before bed, or sometimes I'd just put headphones in like right before I was falling asleep. And then if I had to drive anywhere, I would listen to like the pep talk that you had. So I was kind of obsessed with just like, I want to get these positive thoughts into my head, and it would at least give me like a momentary reprieve from any thoughts that I might be having because I was able to focus on it. So I just made that into routine. I cut out caffeine. I'm not a big drinker really, but I did even cut down on that. Like if I was going somewhere because I didn't want to be hungover. I made that mistake once. I had a friend come over, we're watching football, and he was training to be a bartender. And he was like, let me make a couple drinks. And and alcohol is a funny one because you have one drink or maybe two and you feel great. I mean, obviously, but like with the anxiety,
Yeah.
it kind of dissipated. And we're hanging watching football, and I felt I wasn't even thinking about it. And I woke up the next morning, and it was, yeah, that was tough. I was cloudy and anxious from a hangover, and then cloudy and anxious from DP, and that was a very long day for me. But yeah, so I made that mistake once and then kind of cut that out. But yeah, I just had to make things a routine, and the cutting caffeine, I've noticed drastic effects from that. But kind of how I measured it was, at first I started to think about like every day when I woke up, that was like the first thing I thought of. Like, all right, how am I feeling today? Where are we at? Kind of doing like a clarity check. And I was like, all right, that's not a good idea. I got to take this like in longer spans because, some days are worse than others. And even when I was like close to recovering, I would still have a day out of nowhere that was way worse than I had experienced in months, which can be mentally kind of very challenging to try to get through and just like remember that you're on the right path. But how I started to gauge it kind of so that I could still check in on myself, but I wasn't doing it as frequently, was on Mondays. I kind of took like a gauge as to where I was at. And I did Mondays because Monday through Friday, my routine is exactly the same. It doesn't change. Saturday and Sunday, maybe my sleep is different a little bit. I'm not going to bed at the same time. Maybe I went out to dinner and we had a couple of drinks, stuff like that. So, my routine is off. I'm not doing all the same stuff. Maybe I didn't work out one of those days, whatever the case. It's a little bit of a different routine. So I felt like that when I showed up to work on Monday, if I was like feeling pretty good for whatever reason, in my mind, that was like all right, we're on the right path. So for whatever reason, Mondays were like the day that I was like, all right, I'm doing okay. And if it was a bad day, I could also say to myself, well, you were kind of off your routine this weekend. Get through today. You'll be right back at it tomorrow. So it kind of worked both ways. I don't know if that made any sense the way I was doing it, but it kind of worked. But yeah, I think the recovery it was super challenging. Like I had to keep reminding myself that I am doing the right things. And I would just like I was saying, I would just listen to those things pretty constantly to kind of remind myself that I was on the right path. But the biggest things that I had to get through were like the self-doubt that I was actually going to get through it. That was a huge one for me. And then the other one that was kind of earlier on was that like there's nothing actually inherently wrong with me. Like those were the two like big hurdles that I had to get through because yeah, when you're in that headspace, it seems like there's no way I'm ever going to be able to get out of this. It's like I like the way you described it, that like a switch turned on. That's kind of how it felt. Like I don't know how to turn that off because I don't know what I did to turn it on, so to speak. So that was challenging. But yeah, over time, I started to notice that things got lesser and lesser. Like I would still have the existential thoughts, but I would notice them. The thoughts would kind of come and I wouldn't think about them too much. And then I would notice the same thing with like the brain fog or the cloudiness kind of feeling. And I would it just wasn't as intense as it was. So I was able to just kind of let it go. And then over time it just kept getting a little bit better until I would have hours where I wasn't thinking about it at all, which slowly turned into days where I didn't notice it at all. And then, like I said before, there were days in this too where I'd have a day where I didn't think about it at all. And then the next day, I felt like I was back 3 months. And that was another kind of hurdle to get through. But then the next day I might think about it a couple times. So it kind of like came in waves at that point, and the waves started to get lesser and lesser and further apart. So it wasn't as constant and it was less. And then I just wasn't really thinking about it at all. I did have a couple of months where, like, I think I alluded to this earlier, where it was like, I think I'm recovered, but I can't really tell. And then I would have a moment that I was like, oh no, I guess not fully. I just had this weird thought or whatever it was. So I had that for a little while, but it was so slight that I would forget about it for the most part. And then I just forgot about it is the only way that I know how to describe it. Like I wasn't thinking about it anymore. It wasn't impacting me anymore. And then it was kind of like it didn't happen. Like I had recovered a couple months before I emailed you, and I wanted to email you thanking you for the book. And I just kind of forgot to, because it wasn't even like a part of my consciousness anymore until like my girlfriend brought up that story, and I told her like the brain cancer story. And I was like, oh yeah, I never did that. So that was like what what prompted me to reach out. But yeah, it just kept getting, the waves of it kept getting further and further apart and less intense, and eventually it just kind of drifted off.
Yeah, yeah, that's great to hear. It's interesting what you say, Pat, about the thing of having, when you're making progress, and I absolutely experienced this too, and I think most people do on the way to recovery, is when you start to have days at a time where you think, oh, I haven't thought about this, and you have it under control, and then you inevitably have the day where the anxiety, for whatever reason, just pops up a little bit, and your first thought is like, oh man, I'm back to square one. I'm back, as you said, I'm back 3 months ago. I got knocked down the snakes and ladders down to the bottom again, and I have to start, like, I have to now climb up the whole mountain again, but part of recovery is that, like, it's understanding that it's not like a smooth curve on the way down. It's the stock market, it's up, it's ups and downs the whole way. But what we train ourselves to do in recovery is to not celebrate when we have good days, and not get frustrated when we have anxious days. And then because when we kind of categorize them like that, that allows us to be indifferent to it. If anxiety is there, let it be there. Fine, I got stuff to do. If anxiety is not there, fine, I got stuff to do either way. As opposed to kind of allowing your day to be dependent on whether you have anxiety or not. That's what we train ourselves away from. And also the thing as well of, like, if you've been, there's the idea of, like, what you experience is always relative to what you've just been experiencing. So, like, if you're experiencing kind of like consistent anxiety for, like, let's say 4 or 5 months and DP, and you picked one day out of that, you would think, okay, well, it was difficult, but, like, it was just the same as all the other days, whatever, like, But if you have that same day at the end of, like, 2 weeks of good days, then that day feels like the worst day that's ever happened,
Yeah,
because you're like,
way worse.
Feels way worse. Yeah. But it's just good to kind of keep that kind of focus in mind on the way to recovery. So, how was the DP manual helpful in your recovery, Pat?
It was huge. I mean, the two videos that I mentioned, like the relaxation program I used constantly, and the pep talk was the same way. Those two were like the staples that I had. But it gave me, like I had said, that there was like I definitely had like some confidence issues in like being sure that I was going to be able to get out of it. That was I think one of the biggest things that it kind of like changed my mindset around. Like no, especially like hearing your stories and then hearing how you were able to get out of it. I was like, okay, well, I can do that too. Like if he can do it and he's helped all these other people do it, like it kind of, and it wasn't immediate. It for sure was not the first time I listened to it that I was like, all right, I can do this now. There was definitely, it took some time to like get myself to the point where I felt like I could get out of it. But yeah, and then there was some good tips within there too. The one that stands out to me the most was the caffeine one. I was definitely a pretty heavy coffee drinker. It would usually be like 3 or 4 cups a day while I'm sitting on my desk working, and I never really thought much of it. It was just kind of what I was doing. And then I was still drinking coffee when I had it, but I could tell it wasn't helping. I thought it would because I was cloudy, so to speak, and then so I'd have a coffee and I'd be like, well, I think it just kind of made it worse, and then I'd be like, well, maybe I need another one. Maybe one didn't really do it. I usually have two in the mornings. Maybe I'll have another one, and it would just kind of make things worse. And then the other thought was like, man, do I really have to cut out caffeine? Like I can't just have 1 cup in the morning. So I did that to start. Like I went down to one and it helped. Obviously, I wasn't having 3 or 4 throughout the day. I just have one. But then I was like, I saw the change in that. So then I just cut it out completely. And it was like almost immediate. Like the next couple of days, I saw like a huge leap in progress. So yeah, so that tip was huge for me. The caffeine one. And but yeah, I would say overall, just the amount of confidence that it gave me that I knew I was going to be able to get through this eventually. That was the biggest thing for me was knowing that I would be able to get out of it.
Something that you mentioned earlier as well, I thought that was really, really uh was really powerful was the when you were saying about like that you stayed in a routine, like or you even kind of maybe doubled down on a bit at some point. But it's such an important part of recovery because what what I certainly did and what a lot of people tend to do is you think that because if you get sick with like if you've got the flu or something like that or you got a cold, you think, okay, now I have to kind of square myself away for like a couple of days. I drink plenty of liquids. Like I obviously can't work. I obviously can't like go to the gym, but I will put myself away until I start to feel better, and then I'll get back into the world. Um, but with anxiety-based conditions, that can actually be counterproductive because it just kind of creates this loads of space for the anxiety to fill up and kind of the self-examination and obviously kind of researching the condition, all that kind of stuff. And what routine does is it takes that space away from anxiety. So if you say, okay, I have to be up at 6, I have to go to the gym, I have to do this prep for work this evening, I have to take the dog for a walk, I have to go for a jog, whatever. But when you have that routine, it just kind of like it sucks the space away from anxiety. It doesn't give anxiety anywhere to be. It can't kind of fit in anywhere. Um, it's such a great way of training yourself away from the thought process of anxiety and DP. So it's great to hear that you maintained that throughout it. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that was huge. And you jogged my memory about something about the manual. One thing that you had said in there was like, if you get asked to go do something social, say yes. Like that, you got to do it. And that that was hard too, because I would be in my routine, which concluded with like after dinner, we hang out at the end of the night kind of thing, like put a movie on or a Netflix series or whatever we were watching. But then, like I said, like my brother and I go to shows all the time. Some of them are on weeknights or, whatever, some of your friends ask you to go do something, go to like a Red Sox game or something like that, and your initial inkling is like, there's no way I can do that. Like this kind of started by going to like a show or being in a crowd of people. There's no chance that I can go do that. But eventually I was like, I think I'm just gonna go, and what's the worst case that happens is that I feel this DP, and it's like, well, I'm gonna feel it if I'm just sitting here on my couch anyways. So let's just try it. And that was huge for me because it was very anxiety inducing to get out of my routine to go do something else. But after doing it once, and I was at the show and we're hanging out, and I felt great. I wasn't thinking about it at all. It made me realize, like, if you have to face whatever those things are that take you out of your routine, that make you anxious about going and doing it. Like, I was so nervous to go, but eventually I was like, I got to just do it. And it was super rewarding to do that, because then I realized, it's like, oh, I can get through a band set without having a panic attack, Yeah, so that was huge too. It's just going out and doing stuff, seeing people, being with your friends, being social in any way. That was huge too.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the things we really have to do with recovery is we have to, is that to remember that, like, your body and brain don't need to have anxiety around anymore. Like, this was useful to you for a very, very short period of time when you thought you were in danger, but now you're not in danger. There's nothing wrong. You're perfectly safe. But we have to demonstrate that to our brains. You can't just get into arguments with it. You have to be like, I know I can go to this show and I'll be fine. And if we avoid it, what we're doing is we're demonstrating to our brain that anxiety is so powerful that it gets to decide what I do with my day or my evening or whatever, And then the brain says, well, if anxiety is that important, better keep it around, So, but when we say, okay, no, even if I feel anxiety, I'm going to go and do this anyway. And then you come back home in the evening and you're like, okay, I went and like nothing bad happened. And maybe I felt anxious. Maybe I even felt a bit panicky, but you know what? I didn't go crazy. I didn't die. Nothing bad happened. And now I'm back home. And then your brain says, okay, well, if we're back home and everything's okay, then that anxiety that we felt beforehand, we're going to turn that down next time. And then the next time it's down even further. And then a couple of times down the line, you forget to be anxious about it because you've demonstrated to your brain over and over again that it's not necessary. So Pat, now that you've recovered, this is something that people ask me all the time. Once you recover from DPDR, is getting back to normal really getting back to normal?
Yeah, like I said, I just kind of forgot about it. Like it just kind of went away, and yeah, life just kind of was as it was prior to it. It's very strange. It's almost as hard to put into words as the experience itself, as it just kind of stops, because I know that that's hard to believe when you're like in that frame of mind. But it really did. And forgetting about it, I've said that 100 times, but that's the only way that I can kind of phrase it that makes any sense to me. Is like, I wasn't thinking about it constantly. It wasn't impacting me. It just kind of went away. And yeah, it wasn't an issue anymore, but it completely is just back to normal, as it were. And and I no longer constantly think about how I'm feeling or what's going on in my head. It just kind of happens. And that doesn't mean I don't have anxious moments and stuff like that. Like I had a job interview recently, and yeah, definitely was anxious before that for sure. But then it ends, or even the interview starts, and you're like, all right, I'm good. So then it's acute, it goes away. So you'll still have stuff like that, but it's normal human emotions that we all have. So yeah, it really is.
So last question, Pat. There's going to be people watching this interview who might be in the same situation that you were back in the day, not too long after the concert. If you could go back and have a chat with yourself back then, or if you had advice for those people now, what advice would you have for people struggling with DPDR?
Yeah, definitely. The routine was huge. Stick to your routine. I said I had that week or two where I didn't go to the gym, and I immediately saw that as a mistake in retrospect. So stick with the routine, stick with the exercise, definitely lay off the caffeine. That was another huge one. And just try to have trust in yourself that you're going to get through it. That was very challenging. But just know that it's doesn't have to be permanent, and it's not going to be permanent. You just have to keep doing things day in and day out that are going to get you on the right track to get through it. And there's going to be days where you feel like you're back at square one, like we talked about, and it happens to everybody that's gotten through it. I've listened to numerous interviews that you've done, and they all said the same thing. I had the same thing. You said that as well. It's completely normal. It happens for whatever reason. You just get through it, just like you would any other day, and you just get, just stick to your routine and stick with all the things that you're doing that are going to help you recover, and it will eventually happen. One thing too, I think everyone's support system is different with this. The only person that I told besides the therapist I worked with was my girlfriend, so she was the only one there. And a huge thing for me was when it started, it was a constant communication of how are you feeling today? What was your day like? What were your symptoms like? That kind of stuff, that was great, having that support system. But after a little while, I eventually had to say, like, just treat me as if I'm perfectly normal. I don't want you asking about my day anymore. I don't want you asking about my symptoms anymore. And for her, I'm sure that that's not a great experience. She's worried, that kind of stuff. But for me, that was huge because it was one less time in the day that I had to think about it. So if you're able to take those moments out of the day where you're constantly thinking about it, that's huge. And that can also include like hobbies, stuff that you're doing outside of work or whatever. For me, if I was snowboarding, it was not a concern at all. I wasn't thinking about it. Or if I was playing golf, I was just playing golf. So if you're able to put those days and or minutes and hours and then eventually days into your routine where it's not your main focus, that was huge too.
That's excellent advice. Pat, it's been so lovely to speak to you, man. I am delighted that you're doing so well. I'm delighted that that the DP manual was helpful in your recovery. And thank you for sharing your experience and for such an enlightening interview. I know there's going to be people watching this who find your story inspirational and helpful. It was great to have you on the channel, man. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. I mean, you put out that manual, and I'm not just speaking for myself here. I know that you've helped a lot of people with that. So thank you very much. That's awesome.
It's my pleasure. Pat, it's been so lovely speaking with you. Have a great day, man. Take care.
Yes, thank you, Sean.
Bye-bye.
Bye.